Good day, good afternoon to everyone. Today we will have a webinar and we will talk about El Salvador and crypto regulation over there. My name is Niko Demchuk and I'm a lawyer and compliance specialist working for AMLBot, a blockchain analytics company that provide KYT, KYC services and compliance consulting. Since you are all here, please do not forget to subscribe to our social media accounts, because we post very interesting information plus news about our upcoming webinars, future upcoming webinars. This webinar is about crypto blockchain regulation, and it's a sequence of webinars. In November, we had a webinar about MiCA regulation, yes, that regulates cryptocurrency services in the European Union. It was the first kind of webinar about regulation. The second one was about Bermuda regulation and the cryptocurrency laws over there. And today we will talk about El Salvador. And I think this is one of the most maybe interesting jurisdictions to talk about, especially nowadays. There are so many countries looking at El Salvador to open a business there. It's all over the news. It made to the news. It paved the way several years ago when El Salvador adopted the law where they accept Bitcoin as a legal tender. So basically the same as official currency along with US dollars that El Salvador has. And we have a speaker today, José, who is located in El Salvador, who is working in El Salvador and helping companies to apply for crypto licenses over there. José, please introduce yourself.
Hi, everyone. I guess it's good afternoon or good night for some of you, or some maybe good morning. It's 8 a.m. in El Salvador. I'm a lawyer, practicing for more than 16 years, technology center, basically, on 2021, when the Bitcoin law was issued by El Salvador government, we started a specialized practice on Bitcoin regulations, and later on 2022, mid 2023, on digital assets, since El Salvador has this complementary framework. So we are happy to be here. I would love to understand what are your plans, and also, well, me personally, I'm a Bitcoiner. I do basically live on a Bitcoin standard, and my company as well. So we are pretty much deep dive into not only the regulation, but also on understanding how on a daily basis you can uh, live from Bitcoin and other digital assets.
Very well. Thank you for such a presentation. I think we can already start with the questions that I prepared for you. We all, of course, know, I think most of the participants also heard about El Salvador. They know that it's that they're collecting Bitcoin, that they're very progressive in terms of Bitcoins, etc. But if take one step back, what do you think, in your opinion, what was its prerequisites? What there in El Salvador that actually made it to be on the forefront of the crypto regulation, of the Bitcoin engagement, and the execution, etc.? Do you know maybe any other special reason? Because it's a small country, relatively small country in Latin America, that actually made to the news mainly because of also Bitcoin and cryptocurrency adoption.
Yeah, well, so I have to say that we have definitely a very bold and progressive government. The president, Bukele, is been getting in touch to very clever people all around the world, and he has good advisors, I would say. So when you have a country that's only known globally for bad stuff, which was our reality 8, 10 years ago, right? Anyone knew even where El Salvador was. You definitely need some game changes or ideas in order to completely transform the reality of a country. Advantage is we are a small country. It's about 6 to 7 million. Half of those are adults. The other is still underage. That means it's a very small country, and it's not hard to transform things when you really want to do it. So the government saw a great opportunity on understanding Bitcoin, right? This was a trend already in companies, global companies such as MicroStrategy, and a conversation already in other jurisdictions on how to assess the local economic systems and how to capitalize uh, financial instruments in order to make progress. So, of course, Bitcoin has already proven um, for or more than a decade already, almost 15 years, that it's a hard asset, right? So, in the long term, and we are seeing this already in other countries, right? The government predicted this the day they announced the Bitcoin law. They said, we know we are not going to be the first ones. We know that this is going to be followed by other countries, but we want to be the first. So this was a very bold move. It was a first position, first mover advantage. Initially, it was criticized by a lot of international players, including IMF and some other international relevant entities. Um, they increased country risk. They said this was a stupid, crazy idea and that it was not going to work. Um, well, after 4 years, we still have Bitcoin law, and the government has a strategic Bitcoin reserve. Uh, the price of Bitcoin has proven to be what it has always proved to be in terms of long-term strategy for preserving value. So now this has been even looked at with good eyes, including institutions such as the IMF. So that's kind of the idea behind it, Niko.
True, and as far as I agree with the part of crypto regulation, that Salvador was one of the first countries that adopted crypto regulation. But you indeed have critiques, especially from the International Monetary Fund, and actually, as far as I know, correct me if I'm wrong, you abolished at least one of the norms that is recognizing Bitcoin as a legal tender. So some years ago, Bitcoin was the same as another official currency, USDT. All the businesses were obligated to accept Bitcoin payments for their services, etc. But as of now, Bitcoin is not anymore, does not have a legal status of a legal tender in El Salvador. Is it true?
So let me go back one step because this has been very controversial, and we have been closely working with the Bitcoin office and advising on how to also communicate this message, right? As you know, the IMF, of course, has some power of helping countries at the same time making countries do whatever they want, right? So when you are looking for a loan from the IMF, of course there will be conditions, and it's important to understand how this works into the supra-territorial or uh, sovereign point of view. So, being said, uh, the history of Bitcoin law is actually it's a very short law, and it has only about 14 articles. And the first one basically said in its initial version that in El Salvador, Bitcoin was legal tender. That basically means um, that you could literally pay and acquire every type of obligation using Bitcoin, and at the same time that the government could use it as a means of payment or for investment for public good or public investments. Um, The law actually does not says anywhere, and not the first version, not the second version, that Bitcoin is mandatory. Um, the fact is, when you say that currency is legal tender, it should be accepted everywhere, right? But let me put another example. El Salvador, before having the US dollar, because our legal tender is US dollar, right? We had El Colón, which was our Salvadorian legal tender. Um, Even when in 2000, year 2000, dollars came into the country, colon was still being used. And even now, if you have colones, which is our previous currency, you can still go and people are supposed to accept it. But again, every time I go to this conversation, I tell people, try to go to a store and pay with colones. Let's see if someone accepts it, right? Which it was the currency from 25 years ago, but it's still legally accepted. So once the Bitcoin law came out and it said Bitcoin is legal tender, this was, of course, a very bold move. And the government said, all right, merchants with the capabilities of accepting Bitcoin should do it, right? Um, if you don't have the capabilities to do it, you demonstrate that you don't have it. Let's say the guy who sells tortillas next in the corner, then you are not forced to accept it. So what happened is it actually was never mandatory, and there was never a policy to force people to buy or merchants to accept payments in Bitcoin. People who did it voluntarily. So what happened and what is the change? Since IMF basically said, hey, look, having Bitcoin as legal tender is too risky for you as a country. Why? Because you are trying to pay your external loans using Bitcoin. And we are not agreed with that. Also, you can pay your taxes with Bitcoin. And we think that's too risky for you as a government because if the volatility is not positive, then you won't have money in order to comply with your obligations. So, what's the final idea behind the change? Um, it's only two things. Basically, now Bitcoin law, which is still in force and it still exists, basically says Bitcoin is a legit circulating currency that only eliminates the word tender, but we still have Bitcoin as a legit circulating asset, meaning you don't have to ask for permission to anyone to pay with Bitcoin, to buy Bitcoin, to put Bitcoin in your balance sheet, to use it if you want to buy a real estate, to acquire other investments, because it has legit circulation, right? And the framework is completely the same for everyone. So we have a comprehensive regulation for Bitcoin service providers, clients. The only thing that really changed was from the government side. They cannot pay loans with Bitcoin, not the IMF with Bitcoin, and people cannot pay taxes with Bitcoin. But the reality is, why would you ever pay taxes with Bitcoin, right? That's my personal opinion. But those are the changes.
Okay. Just out also of curiosity, just to see if the law really can affect the adoption of Bitcoin. So once you have this law, once this law was adopted in El Salvador, did it really affect the wide adoption of Bitcoins? Like many regular people learned about Bitcoin, started using it for services, payments, etc., or it's still where the like most of the times is those who are more progressive, who is more into technology, more for investment purposes, etc. Or it's really gains this mass adoption in El Salvador.
That's a very interesting question. And the fact is, what Bitcoin law really pushed was curiosity from the population, right? People see the Bitcoin logo and they said, okay, is this the Bukele coin? Is this the government issued the Bitcoin, right? That there was a lot of ignorance related to understanding what Bitcoin was. Remember, we are a country in development, right? We still even have a lot of gaps in basic education, right? So it's not simple to spread sophisticated knowledge to all people, and definitely a law won't do that. But what really happened is it pushed the interest and curiosity of the population. And after 4 years, what I can tell you is our country now has a deep knowledge of uh, several levels of what Bitcoin is and how you can use it. And it took time. Definitely, it took time. The regular individual, maybe at this moment in time, still doesn't want to know anything related to Bitcoin and doesn't care. But if you start going to the next level, let's say university people, and then professionals, entrepreneurs, businessmen, banks, financial institutions, then after 4 years, you can see that they have been somehow studying what's going on, right? They saw now the US is speaking about a Bitcoin strategic reserve. They are seeing Europe with crypto regulation. They see Japan speaking about having a Bitcoin law, and other countries, right? So now, people with a second or third tier level of education, they now see, okay, this is something I should look into, and I should study a little bit and understand what is it, right? So nowadays, I can tell you Bitcoin adoption has increased more than what happened in the first year, which was really a lot of noise, right? First year, second year, it was a lot of buzz, a lot of, noise. Now, 4 years later, you will see banks having a very solid understanding of Bitcoin. You will see payment processors, you would see digital wallets, you would see exchanges, you would see OTC, people buying real estate with Bitcoin, companies putting Bitcoin in their balance sheet. So that makes it very interesting because it is mature. And then we have digital assets law. We will talk about this, I hope, because this complements everything that is not Bitcoin only, right? And starts to create an environment for financial businesses, right? Digital capital markets. So that's very interesting as well.
Okay, then I have the idea that it's step by step, it's actually growing the adoption of Bitcoin, especially from the business side. And you already mentioned about Bitcoin law and the digital asset law. So I'm also aware, I did research about El Salvador, that you have two types of licenses and also two types of regulation, yes, laws. One is only for Bitcoin and another for digital asset service provider. Maybe you can bring a bit more light. What's the difference? Why it is so? Why it's not a unique, comprehensive legislation, but you have these two different regulation, and one specifically only for Bitcoins, and then another one for the rest of the crypto services and crypto assets.
Yeah. So now that you know a little bit of the history and how everything started, you can easily understand why we have two different laws, right? The government started Bitcoin law. Bitcoin law had a regulation, so a secondary regulatory framework for specific Bitcoin service providers, right? And since Bitcoin was is considered a legit circulating asset, right? It is definitely and should definitely be treated with easement than other digital assets, given that the country has given Bitcoin specifically a category of a legit circulating asset. You cannot do that with Ethereum in El Salvador, right? You can go and buy pizza if you want to Pizza Hut with Bitcoin. You cannot do it with Ethereum, right? So this is the fundamentals on why we have a two separate regulation and a two.
Just to be clear here, just to highlight for
Yeah.
also for participant, it's coming from the fact that at the beginning, the Salvador as a government recognized Bitcoin as a legal tender. That's where
Correct.
it's coming from. Okay, that's only for Bitcoin. Okay.
Yeah,
Okay.
that's like the origin of the separation of the law, right? Because as you can see in other jurisdictions, Bitcoin will be considered a digital asset, and it will fall into a same license, right? So
Mhm.
this is particularly different in El Salvador. So from 2021 to almost 2023, there was a gray area, right? Because a lot of people come into the country, Bitcoiners asking on, okay, so can I use my USDT here? Can I buy a car with the USDC, or can I swap my Ethereum, wrap it, and then use wrap Bitcoin to whatever transaction? And there was no answer, right? There was no legal framework to give clarity or certainty to the rest of the digital asset space. So the government understood there was a big opportunity into creating a landscape, a friendly landscape for digital assets as an industry, not necessarily El Salvador being looked at, let's say, uh, a crypto transaction place where you can, do whatever transaction you want. No, there's a bigger idea behind the digital assets law, and it's important to put it clear from the beginning, just to set the expectations from people who may be looking into El Salvador as a jurisdiction. The digital assets law, it's actually called the the law for issuance of digital assets. So this is basically, yeah, it basically comes from the idea that we are on an era of building digital capital, right? Markets are changing into from traditional paper securities traded in stock exchanges or traditional stock exchanges into um, digital forms. And of course, blockchain technology has brought to the attention of big financial players and institutions of money how this technology can leverage digital capital and democratize it and give access to more people globally. So the idea behind this law from the governmental perspective is to set a landscape where El Salvador is able to have a friendly framework for businesses in capital markets, digital capital markets. So, what can you do there? Um, and what is included into the digital asset law, and what digital asset service providers can do, which is in other jurisdictions called as a VASP, virtual asset service provider, or DASP, digital asset service provider. In El Salvador, the category is called digital asset service provider, and it's separated from what we call Bitcoin service provider or DSP, right? What's the difference? And I will answer some of the questions I see in the chat because the certifier is a different category, but it's included into the digital assets law. So we have different type of operator. Um, the same as you have at the Bitcoin law, right? Digital wallets, custodians, payment processors, and exchanges for Bitcoin and fiat. Digital asset has a wider list of permitted activities. You have definitely exchanges for digital assets.
Right now for our participants to also see it. Sorry. Yeah, sir.
Yeah, so this is the list of the digital assets permitted activities, basically. Um, So you will see that exchange for digital assets, fiat, vice versa, or equivalence for digital assets, it's included into one single license, not as in other jurisdictions, where, for example, if you want to interact digital assets fiat, you need two different type of licenses. So this is an advantage in El Salvador. You can operate from one single license if you are related to the digital asset space. If you want to include your Bitcoin operation, you basically need both. You can be an exchange for Bitcoin and fiat, and let's say you are an exchange for Bitcoin, stable coins, or other crypto assets. Um, you will basically need both DASP license and BSP. So
it's true that you will need two licenses if you will provide services with Bitcoins and another crypto assets.
exactly. And let me go back here with if you can go to the previous slides, like 1 and 2, the previous one. Yeah, that one. So for Bitcoin service provider, this is something important also because it's similar in other jurisdictions where um, obtaining a Bitcoin registry is not purely or legally considered a license, and it works different than the digital asset license. This is actually a public registry. What it means is Bitcoin service providers, and this is reduced specifically to Bitcoin to fiat wallets, Bitcoin only, and fiat wallets. You cannot have USDT in this wallet because then you will fall into the digital assets law. So payment processors for Bitcoin, digital exchange and OTCs, and custodians. These are the principal categories for Bitcoin service providers. So this is granted into the Central Bank of Reserve of El Salvador, which has a specific registry for Bitcoin service providers, supervised by the SSF, which is the same institution that supervises the financial traditional system. Why? Well, again, the track record. Bitcoin started being legal tender, now is still legit circulating asset, meaning it's a financial instrument that can be utilized by anyone, so it needs supervision, but does not necessarily need scrutiny as if it would be a crypto asset, a centralized crypto asset, which is considered to be a higher level of risk. Um, all of these entities also need to report to the financial investigation unit. Yes, sorry, Niko, you were going to say something.
Yeah, just to understand also for our users, because most of the crypto business, if they work with Bitcoin and altcoins. I never heard anyone who is working only with Bitcoins, apart from maybe some custodians, etc. So if they do work, they will need to apply for two licenses, or maybe one registration, as you mentioned, it's not real license for Bitcoin services, and one license for DASP services. The requirements are they the same, or because I know it's different even institutions that is issuing for Bitcoin only services and for DASP. The requirements, they are more or less the same, or in order to receive DASP license, it's much stricter requirements?
Yes, so you are right. If you operate in an operation which has Bitcoin in some portion and other crypto assets, including stable coins or other cryptocurrencies, let's say Ethereum, Solana, etc., you definitely need both. The Bitcoin service provider is a registry, and then if you want to go you jump into the digital asset slide, you will see this is the rest of the activities that will be fall or included into the digital asset license. Why is different? Initially, the regulator is different. For Bitcoin, you have Central Bank of Reserve and Financial Supervision Authority. Here, and this is very interesting as well, we have a special National Commission of Digital Assets. And this is made, tailor-made for incentivizing and enabling a digital asset industry, not SEC like the traditional Security Exchange Commission. This is a digital uh, commission designed specifically to enable digital asset ventures. And it's also important to recognize that the work that SENAD is doing is focused on trying to bring to the country the best of the best, if possible, right? This is
So,
not a license you can buy, let's say,
yeah.
right?
So this is another major differences from another jurisdiction that I'm aware of how they regulate cryptocurrency, that in Salvador, you created a special regulatory body only focusing on digital asset services. Because usually in Europe, in most of the world, this is under the authority of the financial supervisory inspection, or authorities that supervise also e-money institution, investment funds, etc. You here in Salvador, you have special bodies only for these services.
Exactly. And why is this competitive advantage for applicants or people looking at El Salvador? Because the centralized space and digital finance has its own culture, its own vocabulary, its own business models. And bringing this type of transactions into traditional regulators takes a lot of time for them to basically understand it initially and to talk to the same level of language. And then applying a regulatory framework into the daily lives of people, it's another burden. So specialization matters, right? And when you have a specialized regulatory body, which is formed by almost 30 guys, and these are people tech savvy. They have certificates of digital asset from Cambridge. They are um, certified into blockchain infrastructure technologies, right? So this is people that has been training already for about 2 years, and they understand what the decentralized space brings to the table. So you see the list of activities there, right? You can do from exchange to trading platforms to OTC desk, underwriting, issuance of digital assets, tokens. We even have a special regulatory framework for issuing stablecoins. Um, we also have one for tokenizing real world assets. You can build financial instruments in the form of digital bonds, uh, stock, derivatives, future, structured financial products, yields. So there's a lot what you can design into this framework. But the reality is that there's also a heavy list of requirements that we can also review.
Yeah, so good you mentioned, because actually that would be my next question. Me, as a also regulatory lawyer, when I was working in a law firm, helping companies to prepare documentation for licenses or satisfy the requirements, one of the questions that I would love to ask you. Of course, I know I talk to my colleagues, to the crypto community, and then many of them are looking at El Salvador or already went there to receive the license. But El Salvador is a relatively, again, a small country, it's not a big country. And most of the startups that go there, I do not see that big desire to actually have their, let's say, a team there, like a real decision-making processes. They go, they receive the license, but they would love to provide services worldwide, and they usually also located not in El Salvador. So this slide that we have now, it shows the requirements. Maybe you can briefly talk about them, but my main question would be the physical presence. I think that for the most of the startups that look at Salvador would be a key point to decide whether they would love to go there or not. Like, do they need to have the office? Do they need to have people working there? Do they need to have directors? Because this would actually impact the decision. And there are not so many specialists, yes, in Salvador. If so many businesses will come, then compliance officers may not be enough for everybody.
Yeah, this is a great question. And it has been also evolving over time. So before going into specific requirements for the license, let's talk about what's mandatory and what's not in order to look at El Salvador. So the first thing is this law was designed for the digital space, right? Meaning it would be kind of absurd from the regulator to ask for companies to set up a physical operation. So it is not mandatory to have a physical operation in El Salvador, but it is mandatory to domicile an entity. What this means is basically you need to create preferably a Salvadorian vehicle, meaning a Salvadorian company that will basically prove domiciled in El Salvador. So you will need a tax and fiscal address. which you can basically obtain from virtual office service providers or even lawyers who provide that service as well. A corporation in El Salvador, a company, we have a very, similar framework, let's say, to other countries where you have shareholding-based companies or limited liability companies. It's very similar, so that doesn't change a lot in order to incorporate. And something that it's very important is to decide if you would like to have the legal representative of the company, which is different from directors. It's the legal representative is person or individual specifically, because we cannot have legal representation and assigned to a company. It should be an individual. It can definitely be in other jurisdiction. It doesn't need to be in El Salvador. It doesn't need to be Salvadorian. It doesn't need to travel. Everything can be done electronically now because we have a special framework for simplified shareholding structures. SAS is the type of entity, and you can incorporate completely electronically. But there's something relevant to take into account, which is the fact that you will need someone on the ground, at least to handle the relationship with the regulators, especially. For that, there are different alternatives. First could be to name local directors. This is a possibility, but it's not mandatory. Second alternative is through special power of attorneys, where lawyers or specialists can handle the relationships with the regulators. And the third important and mandatory point is that every Bitcoin service provider and every digital asset service provider needs to have an extended AML program based on the GAFI-LAT, Latin American standard for anti-money laundering prevention. We can say this is similar than FATF or the European anti-money laundering standard, but it's a Latin American standard. But what it means is you definitely need to name a compliance officer and a principal and an alternate. It's two at least. And um, this can be based in other countries. They don't need to be Salvadorians, but they do need to be certified and trained under international standards, meaning you need to prove to have a certificate from a relevant entity for AML training, and it needs to be issued from 2 years at least. So it needs to be very fresh, let's say. If you had a training 5 years ago, that doesn't work. You need to have a very fresh AML certificate, and it's the only way that you will get approved, both for the licenses and also for the reporting obligations to the financial investigation unit. The reality is El Salvador cannot handle and will not welcome complete anonymity, right? So only players that are willing to reveal or perform KYC activities are going to be granted a licenses. And I completely respect the fact that a lot of players in the industry will dislike this because they don't want to pursue any type of KYC requirement. But this is not the country for that type of operator, right? The country is trying to stay regulated in that sense, and it actually is also a requirement from IMF and also a requirement from GAFI, which is a Latin American entity for prevention of money laundering. So we have to follow it.
And to be honest, because AMLBot is a KYC also provider, we see in the market that it's not now actually a big hurdle for companies. They want to do KYC because they know what type of consequences they might have if they will not implement the correct AML processes. Okay, then it's very clear about physical establishment, basically a company, and should be a legal representative. Who it will be, it depends on the decision of the company, whether it's a director or it's some other lawyers that is representing the company in El Salvador. Great, I think this is all really good for a business that is very flexible. Now let's move on maybe to the slide that I think looks the most amazing out of all slide, and the information that difficult to believe in is about the taxes that you have in El Salvador for crypto asset service provider. Is it true? Is it so nice like it looks on the slide? Everything is zero and the company doesn't need to pay anything to do such to provide such services?
Yes, yes, it is. I mean, this is part of the government move in order to basically incentivize El Salvador as a place to build capital markets in the form of digital. It's actually the only regulation in El Salvador that has these benefits because definitely El Salvador is not a tax haven. That means that we have very few regimens for tax free. It's not like, for example, BVI or Cayman, and I mentioned these jurisdictions because they are compared to El Salvador, and it's it has to be clarified that El Salvador is not a tax haven, right? It's specific industries that are incentivized. In this case, digital assets. Bitcoin is different. Just also to clarify, because Bitcoin is a legit circulating asset, it has the same treatment as money, so it pays taxes. The only thing that you don't pay is capital gains related to Bitcoin. If you have capital gains on the price of Bitcoin, you don't have to pay tax over that. If you sell your Bitcoin 10 years later and it's worth $1 million, you won't pay capital gains. But if you are a Bitcoin service provider, wallet, custodian, exchange, or payment processor, you pay tax. You pay basically all the traditional taxes. So, how to combine the benefits of the digital assets law, because this that we have specifically on the screen are for digital asset service providers, for certifiers on public or private issuances of digital assets or tokens, and for the issuers itself and investors on digital assets. So this is very wide because it actually is designed both for to benefit the service providers, but also the shareholders and also the investor. So it's a very wide, comprehensive benefit. That's why you see there that it's zero corporate income tax. But this also includes, if you see down in the line, the shareholder dividends tax. So a digital asset service provider won't pay taxes as a corporate, but also the shareholders. Then we have zero withholding tax. That means if you want to take your money to another jurisdictions, the local Salvadorian entity won't withhold tax, which in other environments, it's mandatory, right? You have to withhold 20%. The traditional income tax in El Salvador is 25 to 30%. The VAT is 13%. Withholding tax is 20%. Municipal tax, in the case that you have a local physical operation, it's about 1.50, depending on where you are located. Then you have imports, for example, companies who want to bring computers or any other sort of equipment, there are fees from 5% to 20%, sometimes for luxury goods or even more. So it's also relevant and very important, specifically for capital markets, capital gains, right? Everyone is expecting their investments to go up or to raise value over time. If you are an investor and you acquire digital assets from an issuance performed under Salvadorian regulation, you will get paid tax free. And over time, if you hold those assets under Salvadorian soil, you want to report it, you won't pay capital gains as well.
Okay, so this amazing slide information that I see as a lawyer or as a businessman, yes, everything is zero income, VAT, municipal shareholder dividend tax. Does it have a deadline? Does it have a time limit, or it's for like without limits?
That's a very good question. And I didn't include this here, but that's a very good question. The reality is the benefits are granted with the license, and that means at this moment in time, the government hasn't decided to set a specific time frame. This means you will get reviewed and audited, and you will keep the benefits every year if you get approved and renewed on your license. What this means is if the government decides to change it, it can change, definitely, right? We have seen use cases in other jurisdictions where the governments had 5 years, and then on the year number 6 they started to slightly change and said, okay, we're going to do 5% income tax compared to the 25 traditional, and they are slightly increasing over time, um, and having a preferred condition, but not as it was originally issued. So this is the current framework, and it means it's not necessarily forever, right? These are opportunities that business people understand how this works, right? This will last while the government wants to incentivize this, while the authorities are in line with this vision. But if in 10 years the government changes, this of course can change. So at this moment in time, it's a benefit that it's very solid. We have obtained different licenses and at the same time confirmation from the treasury or the tax authority where they give you a resolution confirming this as well, so you can handle your operation with solid um, credentials and legal documents that confirm this. But the reality is if you do not renew your license, you will lose these benefits, and the
Okay,
renewal is a yearly renewal.
okay, clear here. Interesting approach. There is some clarity, but at the same time, there is no certainty in the long run because you never know what will
Yeah.
happen next. But okay, so that is for me tax benefits that you have in El Salvador. Maybe one of the most um, interesting point to look at when somebody will be looking at where to set up the business. But at the same time, I just read recently the reports by El Mundo. They say that they actually also did research about how there's Bitcoin law working in El Salvador, and they find out that nearly 90% of all those who received Bitcoin license, so those providers are actually not operational in El Salvador. So do you know why the companies go there? They receive this Bitcoin license and then they don't provide any services. They're not operational. And is it the same situation with digital asset service provider where also many companies go, but then they don't provide any services? What is the reason for this?
Yeah, that's a very great observation from not only this newspaper, some others as well. And it's good that I also spoke a little bit on the history of the Bitcoin law, right? Because this actually is related to that, right? Um, as I said, the Bitcoin law started in 2021, and it has secondary rules or regulations, which establish the framework for Bitcoin service providers registry. This means it's not a license, it's a registry. What this means is companies need to apply for the registry, but you won't get a regulatory process in the sense that you need to um, be scrutinized as if it will be the digital asset license. Um, the regulatory supervision for Bitcoin service providers starts after you obtain the registry, and the supervision authority entitles or starts, let's say, um, enforcing its powers only after you obtain your Bitcoin service provider registry. How does it work, and why so many non-operational entities are there? The reason is basically because once you obtain the registry, you get basically a call from the SSF, an email requesting for a meeting, which is the supervision authority starting to, uh, you know, basically enforce the law. And the fact is, once you get this request for meeting and a request for information, the regulations for Bitcoin service providers are as difficult or as scrutinous as the digital asset service providers. This means you will need to present your um, technology details, your cybersecurity policies, your AML program. You need to have compliance officers, both principal and alternate. You need to report to the financial investigation unit. So let's say that 70% of the requirements for the digital asset license will be also useful for being a Bitcoin service provider. That means that if you are looking for both, right, become a BSP and also a DASP, the ideal scenario is that you pursue both at the same time, because a lot of the work that you will be doing for BSP will be used for DASP or vice versa. If you are going for DASP and you need BSP, basically you have it all covered. And the reality is that the first year, like the first 6 months, let's say, um, a lot of people literally came to El Salvador, uh, decided to incorporate a company. They said, I want to have a Bitcoin service provider entity in El Salvador. And they actually didn't even knew what it was. And a lot of companies register and obtain the registry. And once they understood that this was basically becoming a financial institution and that they will be supervised by the same financial institution that supervises banks, and that they will need to have compliance officers and spend money in order to be a regulated entity, they basically left the entities abandoned, right? Because they simply didn't want it to have the burden of being regulated. And you can apply for being removed from the registry, but I can tell you by experience and by clients that I have to be very transparent here. I have clients who came in 2021, 2022. They asked for a Bitcoin service provider license or registry, and once they understood the burden, they simply disappeared. And they said, well, they simply never came back, right? They said, I don't want to be regulated, sorry. And we don't have any sort of authority over the companies because they are the legal representatives. They are the only ones who can manage to be removed from the registry. And that's kind of the idea. And you will see there are about 170 operators. And I can tell you uh, by complete personal confirmation that it's only about 20, 25 real operational companies that are being, in the day-to-day wallets, payment processors, exchanges, OTCs, and these are almost the same, 30 to 35 DAS approved entities in the other regulator. So that makes more sense than only looking at the non-operational entities.
Okay, so basically, there is no similar situation with DASP because it's a matter of the process. Just because it's easy to receive registration, but then you will need to show that you also comply with the requirements. That's where this all numbers came from. But in DASP, you from the start need to actually show that you are fully compliant.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly.
Yeah, we don't have a lot of time, but there is still two questions that I want to have to you, and then we will be picking up questions from the audience. So if you have questions, participants, please type it in the chat or in the Q&A session. So for me, out of big curiosity that I have, because I also know many businesses that were registered as a WASP in European Union. And when MiCA came into force, with a lot of very strict requirements that small businesses would be nearly impossible to comply. So I knew that now looking for new jurisdictions. I don't know if you are very well aware with MiCA requirements, but if you are, maybe you can tell also based on your experience. I don't know even if it's nice to ask this question, but I think most of the business will be looking at it. The requirements that MiCA and DORA and other GDPR, etc., that the crypto asset service provider in European Union need to comply with, are they like the same level as in El Salvador, or where the requirements are stricter? Because if many businesses will leave EU due to MiCA and they will look for another jurisdiction, they would not want to go to somewhere where the requirements are as same as strict as MiCA.
Yeah, that's also a very good question, and we have taken the time to compare, right? That's the reality. And let me give you a let's say a kind of the strategic way to see it, right? So if you are based on Europe, or your market is Europe, and you also want to serve other markets such as Latin America or the US or Middle East or Asia, for example, the fact is, depending on what level of maturity your company has, uh, the way I see it is a country like El Salvador will basically help you level your game to be ready to whatever other jurisdiction. Why? Because El Salvador is its framework is by design, right? This means it was created to enable this type of activity, not to restrict it. And this is the first difference. When you see MiCA, you can tell by its own officials, right? When you see people from MiCA speak in public, you can see they are bankers. You can see they are traditional financial players trying to um, be regulators into a digital space, and that, from my personal perspective, doesn't work. And of course, a lot of people will move. A lot of companies won't like that, especially because it's very expensive. And not only because what you have to pay or the reserves you have to have, is because you also need to pay the lawyers, the financials, the accountants, and it doesn't become accessible for startup level entities, for example. And at the same time, uh, you can see that the requirements that the digital asset license has in El Salvador actually comply with a lot of what other regulatory frameworks have. If you compare some stuff that MiCA has, actually the digital asset law also has that. But the difference is uh, we have a regulator willing to uh, enable it more than forbid it. This is like the first rule. In terms of efficiency, it's a lot faster, right? A license in El Salvador can be obtained, an answer, I would say, not necessarily I'm saying approval or rejection, but the process, if you are also guided by the right people, and I will, uh, this point, because you will see that this is a country that is learning about this, right? The regulator is new. It's only a bunch of lawyers who are practicing around the digital asset space. So you will see also a lot of bluff. And I have to be transparent about this because uh, I've seen people trying to sell services for digital assets license who have never used a wallet, not even for Bitcoin, right? So starting from there, you need to select who to work with, because if you choose someone who tells you that knows the path into the regulator and how to get a license, and they don't, you will spend a lot of time, a lot of money, you will get frustrated because it actually has some sort of formula. The law is very clear, but you cannot simply do a ChatGPT policy. The regulator will read it, will go very deep into the text of your policies, and will compare if your technology matches what you wrote in the regulation and the policies that you have. So all this is kind of what you need to assess initially before pursuing the process. So we always recommend 3 steps. The first one is assess if your company is ready for a license. If it is ready, technology-wise, financially wise, corporate,
regulatory wise, compliance wise, then you can start thinking of preparing for the application, second stage. And when everything is approved internally, then we go to the regulator. But if you just go to the regulator thinking that you have everything you think you have, there's a big risk that you will get a negative result.
Mhm. Okay, great. So just to summarize, I think what I also have seen and read about requirements in Salvador, they're not that strict as in MiCA, but it's also not the country where someone will go and would think they don't need to do anything and they can receive the license. No, they will still need to have a sound AML processes in place, some cybersecurity in place, etc. So that is clear. My last question from me, and then we go to the question from the audience. It's about banks, because it's always a problem wherever you go. Crypto business face difficulties to open accounts. So once you are licensed as a Bitcoin provider or as a DASP provider in El Salvador, local conventional banks, are they willing to open account to you, or they still do not really work? And not because it's prohibited, I'm sure it is allowed in El Salvador by the law, but usually it's a bank its own decision not to work with crypto because it's simply a high risk.
Yeah, in very simple terms, the first 3 years after Bitcoin law, the banks simply said, no, I won't. And they only opened bank accounts for very few players that had very great reputation internationally, or that they have a lot of leverage from the government to open a bank account into a national bank. After 4 years and the regulation in place, we already have one bank, which is a DASP, which is a lot of contradiction from their initial perspective, right? They are already willing to play the game. And we know that there are other banks that have already applied for the license. So they understood now what's going on. And the fact is, banks will open bank accounts for both BSP and DASP. Initially, they will open it just for local dollar transactions, and only if you get the license approved, they will decide the level of approval you will get in order to transact for your business purposes. Meaning, you want to do exchange from Ethereum to USDC or USDT. Well, you will have to present everything that you presented to the SENAD in order for the bank to approve those type of transactions. The fact is, I wouldn't rely on the local Salvadorian banking system for your operation. If you are especially abroad and your market is not in El Salvador, you don't need a bank account, honestly, unless you have like local people working for you here and you need to pay them in dollars. the bank will open a bank account for local transactions very easily, but for
Okay.
your markets, not necessary.
But then when to open the bank account? Because, okay, I understand that the business will need a bank account. That's for sure, yes. Especially if they apply for a license, they will have some crypto to fiat services, etc. So they would need to have some fiat
Yes.
account. So where usually, like based on your experience, your clients or like crypto licensed companies in El Salvador, where do they go to open a bank account if not in El Salvador?
Well, there's a combination of jurisdictions that we usually recommend. We recommend El Salvador for the local operation. If you get the license, then you can evaluate if you use it or not use it, depending on the level of needs you have. But then we recommend Panama, as there are a couple of crypto-friendly banks there. Also, BVI, which it's a complementary jurisdiction we usually suggest specifically for banking, not for licensing. And then, depending where you are located, now the possibility of having a crypto-friendly account in Switzerland or in some jurisdictions as UAE, it's also part of having a complementary arm, right, for your operation.
Based
So
on your experience, just here, I think it's very important to hear your experience if you have such clients indeed. Because I remember when I was working as a lawyer, and then there were like countries that just appeared with crypto regulation, for example, Estonia on one of those, and where many companies went there, they received crypto licenses, but once they turn to a bank and they ask for a bank account, they say, sorry, we don't recognize this, we don't like approve, or we don't care about the licenses you have because we don't see it as a license there. We know that it's very easy to receive it. No one really checks you very well. So they, even if the company is licensed, they didn't want to open accounts because for them, this license were not sufficient, etc. So Salvadorian licenses, crypto licenses, then are, let's say, respectable in the world because even Swiss banks from the Emirates, they are open to work with such clients.
well, that's you know, it's not a yes or no question, but the reality is Panama, it's willing to open accounts for licensed entities in El Salvador, and it's not a lot of banks. It's only one or two, and that's it, right? The rest, and Panama has a lot of banks, but it's only one or two that are willing to be friendly and definitely open the accounts for licensed entities. We have a couple of use cases of Salvadorian entities who even have a bank account in the US, right? And of course, this took a lot of time, like even a year sometimes, but it is possible. And you need to definitely be willing to, invest the time and money to be compliant to what the bank will require, because that's kind of the deal. We also have some clients that have bank accounts in Singapore and UAE. There's a collaboration between regulators, and that's also relevant. The Salvadorian regulator has met with UAE entities, with US regulator as well, and not necessarily Panamanian, because in Panama you don't have a digital asset regulator, but the banks in Panama, which are already crypto friendly, understand the level of scrutiny of the license in El Salvador, and that's why they, case by case, that's definitely a reality, is case by case. It's not that everyone will get the bank account approval, it's case by case. If you are compliant, you have a license, and the due diligence that the bank will perform up to your final beneficial owner is clear, you are very possible going to get the approval in the bank account.
Okay, so thank you so much for this discussion. I finished with my question, and now we start with the questions from our participants. And in the relation, continuing with the bank accounts, we have a questions. Does a company need to have a bank account in order to receive the license?
No.
Okay, so very straightforward. And now the question, in terms of jurisdiction, I don't know how relevant it is, but I will put it in this perspective that when MiCA was adopted, yes, MiCA mentioned that there is a reverse registration basis, meaning that if there is a crypto asset service provider not regulated by MiCA, but the residents of European Union contact you and ask for a service, you can provide such a service without receiving a license in the European Union. So now when we talk about El Salvador, yeah, company goes there, company receives a license in El Salvador. By law, be a lawyer, we know it's actually for only El Salvadorian jurisdiction. But at the same time, we have this reverse registration basis, so meaning you can also have clients from outside of El Salvador, and you don't need to apply for licenses there. So maybe you can also give your view on this, because it's always the matter where does person come, what is the law there. It's not only El Salvador jurisdiction, but what is your experience here?
Yeah. So we requested an official opinion from the regulator, specifically for the territorial principle. And they issued a public communication for DASP entities and also for lawyers, basically, and compliance officers, stating that SENAD goes by territorial principle, meaning the digital asset law. It's applied for domiciled entities in El Salvador and which are under the scope of the DASP license. This means that it only can be enforced into the territory of El Salvador, which also means that even when the law does not forbid at all the fact that you offer services globally, you can definitely do it. It doesn't prohibit the fact that DASP entities provide their services in other jurisdictions. The opinion of the regulator is you should basically not offer these services in countries where it is expressly forbidden to do it. So jurisdictions that have totally abolished digital assets, there are some countries in that list. The government of El Salvador will tell you you cannot offer your services there. On the other hand, if you plan to offer services in countries that have been sanctioned or that are blacklisted or gray listed, and the different lists that are there out there, you should have also a very strict policy in order to treat individuals or customers that may be on those jurisdictions. Meaning, for example, stuff like geofencing, like technological implementation for not allowing people in sanctioned jurisdictions to access your services, not even to look at the website, for example. And at the same time, if you are offering your services from the Salvadorian license into countries that have specific virtual asset treatment or regulatory frameworks, such as the US, such as MiCA, European region, UK, and other countries where there are specific regulations, the recommendation is have a solid strategy on how you will use the Salvadorian license, because you cannot avoid MiCA if you are planning to serve Europeans, right? Not if you are planning to do it from a European vehicle, but if you are planning to use the Salvadorian vehicle and the DASP Salvadorian license to offer service into Europe, there are some considerations you definitely need to look at from consumer protection perspective, from promotion perspective, but definitely there's not a prohibition to offer those services in other jurisdictions. The government of El Salvador cannot enforce whatever prohibition you are breaking, because they are not supervising what you do in Europe, but if you have a European client, they want to know who that client is. You need to have the KYC, you need to have reporting for its transactions, etc., etc. So it's very strategic on how to decide how money moves, and this is what we face when, for example, global clients we have. Sometimes they have 4, 5, even 6 licenses and several special purpose vehicles to move the operation, which is kind of the way that is better assessed.
Mhm. Okay, here's clear. Just also to clarify again, because I see some questions. You in El Salvador, you have public open registers of Bitcoin providers and DASP providers.
Can you repeat that question, please? I think I didn't get it.
Yeah, that you have an open register for Bitcoin providers and DASP providers. They are
Yes.
both available.
Both are public.
Both public. Okay, thank you. There is also another question. I'm not sure I understand it correctly, but Joshua is asking, does SENAD want to see investment in SV as in shareholder value, or is it a red flag?
I understand. I think he's referring to the fact because sometimes if you offer services to Salvadorians, that is considered higher risk, and that's exactly the way they see it. If you are not planning to offer services to Salvadorians, the treatment will be easier, and they will see that as a less risky operation. I think that's what he is referring to.
Okay, so as El Salvador. Okay. Another question that we have is, can a company outside of El Salvador, but in LATAM, obtain a license from El Salvador?
Yes, but you will need to domiciled foreign branch, for example, because it's mandatory to be domiciled here.
Okay. Another question we see is about the timeline to receive the license. So what is, there is a one timeline in the law, but tell me from the practice, how long it takes to receive the Bitcoin license and the DASP license, practically speaking, not by the law.
Yeah, no, but Bitcoin service provider, it's about a month, including incorporation and compliance program and the registry. And DASP, it takes about 4 months, like conservative 3 to 4 months. And if, of course, the company is ready for a license, that means it can take more time in the case that, for example, you want the license, but you will first need to integrate several technology services in order to get approved, and that will take you 2 months. Well, then it will take 4 additional months, which is kind of the regulatory process. But the conservative time we usually work with is 3 to 4 months in order to get an answer. And this could be extended up to 6 months. And if internally you have to complete additional documentation or several other technology integrations that you maybe don't have at the moment.
Let's say your fastest case where you receive the DASP license.
Well, depending on the moment in time, like a year ago when everything was starting with the digital asset law, a month,
Okay.
and that was it. But now it's impossible, right? The fastest we have gotten an answer is 3 months, and the average is 3 to 4 months, like average.
Okay, I think we are done with those also questions because we are already over 20 minutes of our webinar. Jose, thank you so much for your valuable information. I think the conversation in general, the webinar about El Salvador, at least for me, was very interesting, brought a lot of new perspectives and new information, how it's all working there, what to expect, what to look at. You don't mind if there will be also some follow-up questions, we will send it to you, or maybe you can share the email and we will follow up our participants with the email about the webinar the recordings, and if they want to find out more about regulation in El Salvador, they can also send email directly to you or to your company representatives.
Perfect. I'm happy to be following up. Please share my information through the right channels, and I'll be happy to answer more questions. Maybe if something wasn't answered because I wasn't looking at everything all the time, please gather this information, and I'm happy to jump into additional calls or another webinar.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone.
Have a great end of your day. Bye-bye.
Que tengas un buen día también.
Gracias.